non svenu meden olo sulupu prosoligon estitozen totelos o chronos.
So in this third part of our review, we're going to be focusing on two of the major city-states that exemplify the advance of the polis and some of its philosophical, social, legislative developments. Um, we're focusing here again on the Archaic and Classical periods, so roughly contemporary with our discussion of Delphi. Um, and here's some of the topics we'll focus on. We'll spend a little bit of time just trying to describe what a polis is for the ancient Greeks. We'll look at Sparta and Athens in sequence, and we'll spend a little time wrapping up with the role of the Greek polis in the Greco-Persian Wars in the 5th century BC. As we go, we'll recognize a few different themes. So how the advance of the polis represents a developing concern for the equality of citizens under the law, what the Greeks call isonomia, the gradual shift from a greater degree of aristocratic authority toward helping out the people and bringing power to the people, demokratia, the root of our word democracy in English, the mythical paradigm of how lawgivers in Sparta and Athens were both inspired by the Pythia at Delphi, so something of this kind of continuous line that we've been tracing through the cultural memory of these philosophical and social ideas. And finally, how, just briefly, a diversity of cultural perspectives coming together in Athens as a major international center, together with freedom of speech that developed alongside equality under the law, helped to give rise to, or at least made fertile soil for early philosophical and scientific developments in Athens, which we'll be coming back to a little bit later. So let's start with this question of what a polis is anyway. The polis is described by Aristotle, appropriately enough, in the work called Politics, Book 1, Chapter 2, like this. After he's talked a little bit about the individual, the family, and the village, or the smaller community, he suggests that when several villages are united together in a single complete community that's large enough to be nearly or quite self-sufficient, the polis comes into existence. So it's a kind of network of villages. There's a kind of scale criterion for a polis. It originates in the bare needs of life and continues in existence for the sake of a good life. And therefore, if the earlier forms of society are natural, we mean here like family and the village, then so is the polis, for it is the end result, telos of them, and the nature of a thing, the physis of it, its growth principle for Aristotle, is its end result, because what each thing is when it's fully developed, we call its nature, whether we're talking about a human being, a horse, a family. So it's evident, this is kind of leading up to the big point that's so often quoted, that the polis is a creation of nature. That is, the city-state, or the human community, is a natural thing, not just an artificial thing, and that the human being is by nature what's often translated a political animal, politikon zoon, that is, an animal or living being of the polis. Somebody who is without a polis, apolis, is either a bad person, an exile from the polis in that sense, or above humanity, a god. So the polis is, for Aristotle, particularly characteristic of human beings. He recognizes other highly social animals. He thinks of bees, for example, and ants. But the human being particularly is characterized by the generation of this organized community of mutual interdependence and cooperation. It's also important to stress that for Aristotle, the polis is not that big. So it might get as big as 10,000 people, but it's not going to be like a modern nation state or even a modern megalopolis. It's a local and hopefully sustainable institution on its own. Here's a few aspects that are kind of recognizable in the city-states of the 8th century BC and following, recognizing there's lots of variation and lots more we could say about this. They often include an assembly of adult male citizens with voting rights called the ecclesia, a kind of proto-democratic institution, even though it still doesn't give everyone the vote. A boule or council that might set the agenda for the ecclesia, as in Athens. Archons or officials who might be elected or might be chosen by lot or chosen from certain families, and often a coinage. there's some very common spaces as well that show up in the organization of the polis. The agora, that's the community or financial hub. The acropolis or citadel, that's the high point of the city. Often there's a temple that replaces an earlier Mycenaean era palace. The gymnasia, sport again plays an important part as a communal activity and education. Theaters and the drama become characteristically Greek as well, and usually some kind of fortification. So let's talk about a few different polis. First, let's think about, of course, Sparta, or Lacedaemon, in the Eurotas Valley in the Peloponnese. So after that classic picture of a Spartiate warrior, which is almost obligatory in modern popular culture as well, here's where Sparta actually is in the south of the mainland of Greece, Pelops Isle, or the Peloponnese. As we take a little bit of time on Sparta, we'll work through some of these themes. The constitution of Sparta was, according to tradition, dictated by the Pythia at Delphi, insisting on a certain division of powers, the equality of the citizens, and the authority of the people. The Pythia was said to have dictated this constitution to Lycurgus, a legendary lawgiver there. A fairly distinctive feature of Spartan life is that women had relatively high degrees of legal freedom and autonomy alongside men. So this is a relatively progressive element of Spartan life compared to some other Greek polis. At the same time, there's a very dark side to Spartan life and organizations. After a certain period, as we'll see, they subdued a neighboring population, the Messenians, into a kind of state of permanent serfdom or slavery. These were the Helots. And this is a motivation for the perpetual militarization of Spartan institutions. Alongside that perpetual militarization, there was this ideology of martial honor, which has often led to appropriations of the Spartan legacy for bad reasons today, including those images of the Spartan warrior that I just shared. There's both a dark side and a bright side, perhaps, to the popularity of Sparta in modern popular culture, which I'll say a bit later too. Thinking back to our theme of the transition between palace and polis, if we go back to the Eurotas Valley, we're nestled between the Taygetus mountain range and the Parnan mountain range in the site of what's probably a Bronze Age Mycenaean palace, like Mycenae, the legendary home of the Homeric Menelaus, who was the husband of Helen of Sparta, Helen of Troy. Even though this site hasn't yet been excavated, some Linear B tablets have been found nearby, so it does seem likely that there was a Mycenaean palace there. There was a break in its occupation, but it was reoccupied after the Bronze Age decline, and there was a recognizable polis or historical community of Sparta in the 8th to 7th century BC, which was peopled by Dorian Greeks with 5 constituent villages. Later on in the 8th century, this community was forcibly engaged in the occupation of Messene nearby, which was peopled by Dorian Greeks. So let's take a little bit of time to talk about the first of these really significant polis on our agenda for this part of the series, Sparta, or Lacedaemon, nestled in the Eurotas Valley in the Peloponnese, the Isle of Pelops in the south of mainland Greece, associated especially with a profound militarization, which has often been valorized and even appropriated since, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well as imaged in this depiction of a Spartiate warrior. Geographically, again, we're here in the mainland of Greece, pretty close to Mycenae, and some of the themes we'll try to work through include the way the constitution of Sparta came from Delphi, dictated perhaps by the Pythia in part, insisting on a division of powers, the equality of citizens, and the authority of the people. We'll think a little about the unusual setting of Spartan laws relating to the freedom and autonomy of women, for example, in land ownership, which was somewhat distinctive on the Greek scene. We'll talk about the dark side of Spartan institutions, including the perpetual systematic oppression of the Helots, nearby Messenian Greeks, also speaking a Dorian dialect of Greek, who were defeated by the Spartans in a war that led to this perpetual militarization of Sparta to keep them working the land as serfs without full rights that were shared with Spartan citizens. This kind of perpetual oppression was part of the reason for Sparta's militarism and ideology of martial honor. So there's this to consider in thinking about some of the more positive aspects of Spartan institutions as they're appropriated today or as they were appropriated in the past. When we move back to the origins of Sparta with, again, our theme of the line from palace to polis, that is from the Bronze Age to the early historical period, we can spend a little bit of time on this mountain range. This is the Taygetus mountain range in the Peloponnese. Down below from this mountain, nestled between this range and the Parnon range, is a fairly fertile valley, which might be the site of a Bronze Age palace that hasn't yet been excavated, also belonging to the Mycenaean tradition, and possibly the home of the Homeric hero Menelaus, who was the husband of Helen of Sparta, or Helen of Troy. There is some reason, despite the fact that we haven't found it yet, to think that there is a Mycenaean palace there. Some linear B tablets have been found close to there, which is an encouraging sign. There was a break in the occupation of this region after the Great Bronze Age decline, and then a recognizable historical community arises in Sparta around the 8th or 7th century, peopled by Dorian Greeks with 5 constituent villages. Think back to Aristotle talking about the polis coming from villages. That was very much the case with Sparta, where these 5 villages banding together formed the polis. During the later 8th century, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, this community was engaged in a battle with Mycenae, which was populated by other Dorian-speaking Greeks, and the Spartans compelled most of the Mycenaeans to act as a class of land-working serfs, sometimes called by the Spartans the Helots. This, of course, led to a series of rebellions. Aristotle compares, incidentally, the permanent serfdom of the Helots, though he doesn't think of it as slavery exactly, and some sources distinguish it, to the possibly indigenous perioikoi on Crete. These are people who are also denied the full rights of citizenship, as the Helots are in Sparta. So there's a kind of militarized, systematic oppression of an entire community, and the fact that the Helots are involved in working the land and bringing forth the fruits of the earth is what makes possible the military training of the Spartan citizens, which in turn is necessary to perpetuate that oppression. So this vicious cycle is part of the foundation of Spartan society. The Spartans were also regarded as exceptionally pious, according to the historian Herodotus. They would consult the Pythia at Delphi about most of their major decisions. And in addition, we can recognize something of their religious life from the sanctuaries that they dedicated to Athena, the city holder, Artemis Orthia, and to Apollo, who, as the oracle at Delphi, was sometimes conceived of as the source of their constitution, which we'll talk about in just a moment. Spartan women were regarded by other Greeks as unusually powerful and relatively free. They held legally nearly half of the property, perhaps 2/5 of the property in Sparta. They had a role in managing some state affairs, according to some sources, and were at least perceived, as Aristotle reports in the Politics 2:9, to have considerable liberties as citizens. However, they did not vote in the assembly, and the roles through which women's authority was mediated were evidently still sharply demarcated. For example, in religious spheres, like priestly offices, and in motherhood, as we find in some literary sources as well. According to the Platonist philosopher Plutarch, reflecting some of this evidence, classical Sparta refused to allow anyone to have a named tombstone in the spirit of equality, with just 2 exceptions: soldiers who died in battle and priestesses who died in office. This has been extensively studied, the phenomenon of women's role in Sparta, also diffracted through popular culture. One figure who's particularly significant, and I'll quote here a version of this saying from Sarah Pomeroy's excellent book, Spartan Women. A woman from Attica, that's Athens, asked, "Why is it that you Spartans are the only women who can rule men?" And Gorgo, the Spartan queen, replied, "Because we are the only ones who give birth to men." So at the same time, that's quite a response. And also it illustrates how the role of motherhood in a way can be seen in Sparta as mediating women's power and autonomy. A little bit more about this very unusual militarized constitution. The military aspects of it are fairly distinct, and there's some aspects of the distinction from Cretan institutions that emerge in Plato's laws. Those institutions may be seen as less perpetually militarized than Sparta. So that's one thing that's quite odd about Sparta, and as we said, it is partly motivated by the systematic oppression of the Helots and the perpetuation of that cycle. But there's other aspects to Spartan institutions that are quite a bit more like Cretan institutions, as we'll see, and as Aristotle observes. And some of these aspects may have been dictated, at least again, according to the cultural memory and tradition, by the Pythia at Delphi in what's sometimes called the Great Retra, or the Retra, the great saying, the great kind of report of the Pythia to the legendary lawgiver Lycurgus. This is how the story goes according to Herodotus. The Spartans were actually in the situation of having the worst government of almost all the Greeks anywhere, but their conversion from bad to good government went like this. Lycurgus, whose name literally means wolf worker, he's a semi-legendary character, one of Sparta's most worthy men, went one day to the oracle at Delphi, and as he entered the inner shrine, the Pythia spontaneously proclaimed, "You have come, Lycurgus, to my rich temple. You are dear to Zeus and to all on Olympus. Do I speak to a god or a man I know not, yet I rather think to a god, Lycurgus." And then some say that the Pythia dictated to him the laws that established the present Spartan way of life. The Spartans say that Lycurgus brought these new institutions from Crete and established some of Sparta's most characteristic institutions, communal food, the board of ephors, and the council of elders, to which we'll return shortly. This is one report, again much later from Plutarch, of the great Retra of the Pythia. When you've built a temple to Zeus Selanius and Athena Selania, divided the people into fuli, these are like clans or tribes as they're sometimes translated in scholarship, and into obi, phratries, or kind of siblings, and established a senate, gerousia, of 30 members, including the archagetai, kings, then from time to time summon the assembly, the apella, between these tributaries of the river Eurotas, and there introduce and rescind measures, but the people, damos, must have the deciding voice, kuria, and the power, kratos. Right there, interestingly, in the conclusion, we have the word democracy, demokratia. This is the Dorian Greek form, damokratia, or damos with kratos. Here we also have the basic division of powers in the Spartan constitution that, at least in this version of the story, the Pythia is dictating. There are 2 hereditary kings who come, according to the legend, from the bloodline of Heracles and have a religious and military role to play in Spartan society, for example, in leading the army. There's 5 overseers called the ephoroi, well, literally overseers. They're elected. One is elected each year by their village. Remember, there's 5 villages constituting the polis in Sparta, and then new ephoroi are elected the following year. There's also a senate, or gerousia, elected by vote, constituted by 28 men over the age of 60, plus the 2 kings, giving you a number of 30 senators, and the assembly, which actually votes by show of voice or noise, consisting of the adult male citizens, the Spartiates, who go through this extraordinary military training called the agoge in their education. So there's a, so to speak, very democratic element in the assembly, granted the limitations of who participates, which are significant, but compared to a system that was only a hereditary kingship, it can be seen as an advance toward democracy. The power of the kings is also checked by the ephors and by the Senate, and having all these different powers divided can be seen as an antecedent to some modern notions of the division of power in government. The Spartans with this sort of militarization are famous for lots of zingers, not only arrows, but sayings. So, for example, at the Battle of Thermopylae, which we'll talk about a little bit later, the Spartan Dianekes was told that the Persian archers were so numerous that when they shot, the arrows would blot out the sun, and he responded, "So much the better, we'll fight in the shade." On the morning of the 3rd and final day of the same battle, the king Leonidas, knowing they were being surrounded, famously said to his men, "Eat well, for tonight we dine in Hades." Spartan mothers and wives were said to give a departing warrior his shield with the words, "with it" or "on it." Nearing death, one Spartan general, Agesilaus, was asked if he wanted a statue and said, "No, if I've done anything noble, that's enough. If I've not, all the statues in the world will not preserve my memory." There's also the tradition that the Spartans had very little to say. They were people of few words, hence our saying that comes from the land that Sparta's on, Laconia, when we say laconic, a little like we say of the Spartan simple lifestyle, Spartan, in English. One example of a very laconic response is the response that is supposed to have been given by the Spartan ephors to the Macedonian king Philip II of Macedon, when he said, "You're advised to submit without further delay, for if I bring my army into your land, I'll destroy your farms, slay your people, and raze your city to the ground." And the Spartans replied, "If." There's also a little to say about the appropriation of the memory of Sparta, maybe famously in films like 300, where Sparta is represented as a kind of icon of the Western world fighting for a way of life against faceless and villainous hordes from the Middle East, leading to also memes that are perhaps less harmful. But it's important to say that there is a danger in the romance with Sparta as well, a sense that in some ways this militarization of a society grounded in systematic oppression is not a model that philosophically we should want to follow or valorize. At the same time, we can appreciate that some elements of the Spartan constitution, including the relative equality of women, maybe some aspects, though not all, of the division of powers, can be recognized as a significant positive influence. And in addition, we can say that something of the Spartan education system and commitment to education is important. And the democratic element in the government, if we can call it that, the Pythia is said to have dictated would prove to be influential. We might also recognize that in some of the major battles that Sparta was associated with, like the battle with the Persians, the Battle of Thermopylae, the Greeks themselves were much more sensitive to the humanity, perhaps, at least some of the time, of both sides in the struggle than some popular representations have been. Aeschylus, the Athenian playwright, for example, in The Persians, a play staged in the 5th century, reflecting back on the Persian and Greek wars, has a character say, "Such is the flower anthos of the Persian land, such is the flower of men that has disappeared. The entire land of Asia laments the men she nourished with fierce longing. Parents and wives counting the days tremble at the increasing length of time." So there's not a celebration of victory only for the Greeks, but a recognition of the pain of war and the suffering that's caused on all sides by violence. So let's try to pull together some of these themes briefly. We've talked again about how the Pythia at Delphi was said to have dictated a constitution that established this division of powers. We've talked about some aspects of the relative legal freedom of women, for example, in land ownership in Sparta. We've also talked about the oppression of the Helots and its role perhaps in motivating the perpetual militarism in Sparta and the ideology of martial honor that went with it, and some of the ways that the Spartan legacy has been appropriated and reused more recently. Let's turn now to think about Athens, sometimes called the School of Greece, as is reflected in this famous painting, The School of Athens, by Raphael, which actually brings together many, many different figures from throughout ancient Greek history as in one place, thinking of Athens as that place. Athens is also a polis situated in the Greek mainland in Attica. So we're a little bit northeast of Sparta and Mycenae, a little bit southeast of Delphi. Some of the themes we'll try to look at here include the extraordinary continuity of Athens through ancient history, the great wealth of evidence we have for Athens, and the resulting, what's sometimes called ethnocentrism, the way that most of what we know about a lot of Greek history we know through sources in some way colored by knowledge in Athens. We'll talk about the road to so-called democracy in Athens with figures like Draco and Solon and Cleisthenes, including the value for the equality of citizens under the law, the exchange of power in government, and some of the ways Athens too has been borrowed, reused, received, or appropriated in the modern world. One lovely quote that Paul Cartledge quotes from Virginia Woolf about Athens is also on screen here. Masterpieces are not single and solitary births. They're the outcome of many years of thinking in common, of thinking by the body of the people so that the experience of the mass is behind the single voice. In a way, this reflects something of the Athenian idealization of the demos, of democracy, of the way in which there's enough kind of build-up behind an idea of transformation that when the time comes, it moves quickly and takes hold. We'll see this in the course of Athenian democracy, for example, with the reforms attributed to Solon and Cleisthenes in the Archaic period. So a little bit of background. Ancient Athens was continuously inhabited for about 5,000 years, right back from the present. There's no real clear break between the Bronze Age and the Dark Age material record, again using Dark Age in inverted commas, meaning dark to us, but the period after that Bronze Age decline and before the rise of the Polis. Athens is then one of the world's oldest surviving named cities with such an extraordinary continuous record of human occupation. It was sacred to Athena, the goddess of wisdom, almost as far back as our histories can suggest. Athena, who gifted the city with the olive tree. That's significant in part because the economy of the region that surrounds Athens, called Attica, was rooted in the olive, in the crop of the olive, in olives and olive oil. Athena's symbol was also the owl, which was a familiar presence in the city throughout antiquity. Hence, you would sometimes say, sending owls to Athens for giving somebody what they already had a lot of. Athens was centered on the Acropolis, which literally means the high city, which is pictured here in a much later neoclassical imagining. It was first inhabited, we think, in the Neolithic period, in the Stone Age, and a river runs through the city, as in so many cases, with access to the sea nearby through the harbor at the Piraeus. There is a huge archaeological, artistic, and written history in Athens. In one quote already from Cicero in the 1st century, "Wherever we go in this city, we're stepping on history." This partly helps to shape the Athenocentrism, that is, the kind of centered on Athens-ness of the record, material and especially literary, of what we have for ancient Greek life. Coming back to the theme of the palace to polis transition from the Bronze Age, it seems like there was a Bronze Age Mycenaean fortress in Athens around the 15th or 14th century BC. This palace in cultural memory was associated with the hero Erechtheus. Athens might have passed through a sort of unbroken period, not destroyed by the Bronze Age collapse that brought an end to so many Mycenaean centers, even though it did suffer from the general economic decline. Some kind of hereditary rule by kings seems to have continued perhaps to the 9th century. The last king we know of in legend was Codrus, who sacrificed himself to save the people of Athens from the supposed Dorian invasion, based on an oracle from Delphi. A little bit later, a process that's sometimes called in Greek sunoikismos, bringing the oikoi, or houses, together, began to unite the villages of the region of Attica into one community that was centered on Athens in particular. But in the 7th century, there were enough social inequities and violence that arose from blood feuds between aristocratic families in particular that a major system of reforms was needed. The person who gave those reforms was Draco, who gave Athens its first written constitution in the 39th Olympiad, that is the 39th Olympic Games traditionally. For us, that's about 622 to 621 BC, and established those laws in a public place. Because they were written, it was a lot harder for inequities to develop between people who knew how to work with the oral law and those who didn't, and so there's a kind of proto-democratic element to what Draco did. But the punishments that he laid out for crimes were extremely severe, with the death penalty being super common. This led to the epithet draconian for Draco's laws, and led the Athenians to need a replacement set. This brings us to Solon. Solon was born to an aristocratic family in the later 7th century BC. He was, at different stages in his life, a poet, a general, a merchant, and maybe most famously, a giver of laws. He introduced a whole new series of legal reforms around 594 BC to replace Draco's laws, those draconian laws. According to the legend, Solon also consulted the Pythia at Delphi, who encouraged him to proceed. "Take your seat amidships," she said. "The pilot's task is yours. Perform it. You have many friends in Athens." That's from, again, the later Platonist philosopher Plutarch. Also, according to Plutarch, Solon's association with Delphi continued. He was remembered as one of the 7 sages whose wisdom was inscribed in the Delphic maxims. He was said to have followed the advice of the oracle in other matters and to have encouraged the Athenians to protect Delphi in the Amphictyonic League. So what did Solon do? What was up with his constitution? One thing that happened that was really important is all debts were abolished. Debt slavery was ended. Serfdom, or the working of the land in a kind of wage slavery, was abolished, and large landed estates were divided up. Wealth instead of birth was made a criterion for political positions and authority, which also reduced aristocratic power. There was still some class difference based on wealth, though, and not all sides were satisfied, so some people thought it was too much, some thought it was too little. One contrast was with the absolute equality imposed by Lycurgus on the Spartiates of Sparta. But the lowest class in Athens did get the right to vote in the assembly and act as a jury, again speaking here of citizen men only. This became increasingly important as juries were deciding important cases. Those draconian reforms were repealed except for the ones concerning homicide, where draconian laws continued. Solon's verse was also written in this kind of proto-democratic way for all to see and consult, and it was written in verse. It was a poem. After delivering the constitution, Solon entered an exile, self-imposed, to make sure that he wouldn't become a dictator. Some record that during that time he visited Egypt and studied philosophy with the priests of Heliopolis there. This is a particularly strong tradition in Plato as well. But a period of tyranny follows Solon's reforms. Even though he'd laid the groundwork for what we would later consider the Athenian democracy, there was enough dissatisfaction with the reforms that there was room for a demagogue to seize power, and that demagogue was a man called Pisistratus. He seized power, or what's sometimes called tyranny, in the Greek sense initially not necessarily with a negative valence, but someone who gets power unconstitutionally for themselves. They might do good things or things perceived to be good with it, or bad things with it. Usually later it was more clearly perceived that they tended to be bad things. Pisistratus took his tyranny with the support of the majority of the people in an early case of a kind of populist demagoguery, and held it between 561 and 527. Solon was firmly opposed to this, but he didn't manage to persuade the Athenians, and even though Pisistratus invited Solon to return, he lived in exile. Now, Pisistratus, even though he was an autocratic dictator, supported the lower classes. He facilitated loans to the poor, he faced down the aristocrats, he funded the arts and public works, he supported some of the first organized recitations of Homer, which helped to generate a set text, that is a sort of authoritative edition. So later his rule was sometimes remembered quite positively, even as another age of Chronos. But when his sons were installed as tyrants, they were a lot less successful. They were overthrown in 510 when in fact Sparta was encouraged by Delphi to liberate Athens from the tyranny. There was another brief power struggle, and then a man called Cleisthenes initiated a set of more reforms. And we're getting there. We're almost at so-called Athenian democracy. I say so-called only because it's rather different from what we call democracy. In these reforms, the political organization sort of center shifted from families to location, what Cleisthenes came to call the demes, or the peoples, with about 139 distinct demes established. Personal names were often patronymic before this, so you would be so-and-so, son or daughter of so-and-so. That son or daughter of bit, usually named for the father in what's called a patronymic, was changed with these reforms to encourage the use of a demonymic from a place. So this de-emphasizes family again and emphasizes shared community and location. Also really important for the later democratic developments, citizens were randomly selected for positions of power under Cleisthenes' reforms. And the boule, or council, was reorganized to propose laws to the assembly, to vote on major measures. So most major decisions are made by a popular vote by referendum in the assembly. These reforms were described in their own time as isonomia, or equality under the law, and helped to give roughly the shape to later Athenian democracy. At this point, we can recognize that as Athens really came into its own in the 5th century, a lot of different people, cultures, and outlooks came together there as a center of economic and cultural discussion, exchange. And coupled with the freedom of speech and equality under the law that characterized the reforms of Cleisthenes and the ensuing Athenian institutions, there was room for some of the kind of magic uses of speech that are associated with both sophists and philosophers in the 5th century, which we'll be coming back to a little bit later. We can also recognize that often many of these ideas are borrowed or appropriated in later history. Many different powers, political organizations have laid claim to the ancient Athenian democracy as their own or our own in a way that is useful to be sensitive to today as well. So those are some of the themes we can think about with Athens in general, its extraordinary continuity, why there's so much evidence there, why much of our documentation about ancient Greece is centered there, some of the different reforms that paved the road to equality under the law, isonomia, and demokratia, and some of the ways as well that those developments in particular can be appropriated even today. Just at the tail end of this consideration of the polis, let's take a little bit of time with a major event that involved both Sparta and Athens in the 5th century, which is the Greco-Persian Wars. These events begin from what's sometimes called the Ionian Revolt. Casting our minds back to some of our story in Athens, during the conflict of the Athenian tyranny, Pisistratus' son Hippias fled to the Persian Empire, which was then ruled by Darius I. The Persian satrap Artaphernes instructed Athens to accept Hippias back as tyrant. Athens refused and declared a state of war with Persia. Moving forward a little bit, even though nothing came of that at the time, in 499 in Anatolia, the tyrant of a city called Miletus, that we'll be talking about a little bit later, his name was Aristagoras, incited a revolt of the Ionian Greeks, these Greek colonists in Anatolia, against the Persian Empire. And Athens chose to support that revolt for a few reasons. Partly because Persia had supported the tyranny of Pisistratus' son Hippias, so they had a bad memory about that, and also because they felt there was a kinship between Athens and the Ionian Greeks in Asia Minor. Sparta incidentally declined to support the revolt. Persia then suppressed the Ionian revolt, and the king of the Persian Empire, Darius I, began planning this giant invasion of mainland Greece. According to the Greek sources, he was motivated in part to engage in punitive action against Athens for supporting the revolt, but also to make a point and secure the empire against further revolts. We don't have quite as much evidence to go on from other sources to think of what exactly Darius might have intended, but that was the perspective from the Greek sources. The first Persian campaigns that started in 492, while they're remembered as just huge by the Greek sources. In 490, some 600 warships or triremes were sent to Greece according to Herodotus. Ancient estimates of the Persian infantry are in hundreds of thousands. Modern estimates are quite a bit lower, maybe closer to 25,000. But any which way, it was a heavily outnumbered Athenian infantry or hoplite army that met the Persian invasion in the Battle of Marathon in 490, and unexpectedly succeeded in routing the invasion force in spite of the difference in size and scale. And there's been a lot of speculation about why that we don't need to get into too much depth with here. Darius' son, Xerxes, then planned a more systematic invasion of the Greek mainland and got together a much bigger force in 481, which has left a profound imprint on cultural memories as well, at least those influenced by the Greek tradition. Herodotus reports an army of some 2.5 million that drank rivers dry, though modern estimates are nearer 200,000. This is where the Athenian statesman Themistocles interprets an oracle from Delphi to trust in the wooden walls to suggest that Athens should focus on a naval defense. And meanwhile, a Greek force of 7,000 is led by the Spartan king Leonidas, with a bodyguard of 300 veterans with children, knowing they may die in the process, to block the progress of the land invasion at the very narrow pass of Thermopylae, the Hot Gates, for 7 days. The oracle at Delphi had suggested that a king's death might save Sparta, or so Herodotus reports. The back road was betrayed to Xerxes. Leonidas dismissed the allies of the Spartans and held it alone, most famously with these 300 hand-picked Spartan veterans. Not as often mentioned, the 700 Thespians, 900 Helots. Remember, these are the people who were in effect slaves working for the Spartans, and 400 Thebans. All of them together made a last stand. The 300 Spartans fighting very bravely and famously, and leaving this imprint again on memory for generations. It made time for the other Greek polis to retreat and regroup. Athens then was in a position to defeat the Persian fleet in their decisive naval battle at Salamis in 480. Xerxes retreated, and the remaining Persian force was defeated by a Greek alliance at the Battle of Plataea a little later in 479. This, in a way, paved the way for the rest of the 5th century BC in Greece, which would later be recalled, again with this kind of centered on Athens memory, as a classical period, where a lot of the philosophy that we'll be talking about went on. The Athenian Acropolis, which was largely destroyed by the Persians in the course of the invasion, was rebuilt in a huge effort that led to, for example, the construction of the Parthenon we know on the Acropolis today, dating from the building works of the democratic statesman and general Pericles. This is also the time when drama, the ideas, sort of proto-scientific developments in Athens really flourish. At the same time, Athenian political and economic expansion would lead to an empire based on naval supremacy, economic power, and tribute, and Athens became a thriving center for economic and cultural exchange. This led into a conflict with Sparta's mainly land-based power, and this led to the major wars between Athens and Sparta known as the Peloponnesian Wars, documented by the historian Thucydides. Sparta finally, after a long, protracted, and on both sides horrible war, defeated Athens in 404 after involving lots of Greek polis in the alliances, but refused to destroy Athens. The Spartan king is reported as saying that he would not be responsible for the destruction of a city that had done so much for Greece. Athenian democracy was later restored, and a number of major developments continued in the 4th century, which is when, for example, Plato lived and wrote the dialogues of Socrates, reflecting conversations in the preceding century. So these are some of the topics we've covered and tried to give a little bit of context to in this part of the series. We've talked a bit about what a polis is, how these communities evolve, some of the Spartan and Athenian institutions, influenced in part by the oracle at Delphi, at least in cultural memory, literary tradition, and the way the polis acted in the Greco-Persian Wars. We've thought conceptually about the developing concern for the equality of citizens under the law, isonomia, the focus toward power of the people, or the demos, the mythical paradigm of the lawgiver inspired by the Pythia, thinking a little bit about some of the values, perhaps including that Damos will have the kratos, people power that we saw in the Great Retra, at least remembered as dictated to Lycurgus, though again, this may be a matter of cultural memory more than history. And in addition, the way that Athens as a major economic center would become a venue for many different cultures coming together with the possibility of intellectual exchange and the development of some of the movements we recognize as philosophy.
Το τέλος ο χρόνος απέτυχε.